Well, we're back to the old spot today. Here we go. There always was in Cordelia's attitude to Mr. Evans. There had been from the start something at once old maidish and maternal, something of the passion which frustrated, love-starved women feel for cats and dogs and parrots, especially the cantankerous and eccentric among such creatures. To Cordelia, this whole business of the pageant had been a vexation and an annoyance. She regarded it as a mere characteristic whimsy of her father, while Mr. Evans's mania for playing the crucified she looked upon as an arbitrary madness, a sort of willful mental indulgence that she had feared all the time might lead to disaster. Persephone, on the other hand, had so many neurotic manias in herself that she responded like touchwood to the quiver of Mr. Evans's perverted heroism. As she had embraced the wooden beam beneath her feet, she had felt, vibrating through its dense oaken veins, the wild triumph of his tense, tormented nerves, the savage rapture of his self-immolation. And she had fancied, too, in a passionate delusion that had sent an electric wave of reckless confederacy through her woman's flesh, that Mr. Evans was not indifferent to her presence there, was not unaware of the reciprocity of her mood. A strange virgin mother had she been to a singular savior of a wounded world. Pressing her flat boy's breast against that oaken post and straining upwards towards her imaginary God-man and divine son, she had allowed herself to yield to the utmost to this new, unexpected tenderness for a man she knew nothing of. Oh, getting a little kinky here. Such and not otherwise had been the feeling of Persephone's spear as she had lifted up her voice and wailed aloud, "My son and my God and my son!" as the Middlezoy young man had instructed her. Little had Ned Atling known, little had those Dubliners known, the wild Maenade-like feelings that their Gothic dumb show had evoked in this morbid girl. Had she been aware, as she crouched and moaned at the feet of her madman, of the psychic waves of swooning adoration flung towards her figure from the white-cheeked girl seated there by the yawning Mr. Beer? Not consciously aware of a surety, but such waves of electric passion seldom, like lightning bolts, lose themselves in the unrestoring earth. Some tremor, some vibrant residue, however faint, reaches, as a rule, the object towards which such feelings are directed, and it may well have been that this shivering, yearning idolatry for her, reckless as some young nun's worship of the real blue-robed maid of heaven, had quickened the pulse beats of her own passion as she poured forth her spirit in a strange new tenderness never felt before. Such were the feelings of Persephone. But the girl was wrong, wrong as so many other worshippers of God and men and beasts and demons are wrong. Mr. Evans was totally and entirely unconscious of her presence at the foot of his cross. That oaken beam that had carried the trembling of his emotion to her and had made it shiver through every channel of her frame till it reached the center of her organic life had, for some occult reason, absorbed and not transferred the emotion which she felt. All that wild, dark, lovely sense of being isolated with this hook-nosed, contorted mouth, victim of his own strange mania, isolated with him on an austere promontory of confederate fate, was in reality a groundless illusion. In this particular case, quite otherwise than in Angela's, there had been a break of contact. Perhaps a girl's nerves responded to the nerves of another girl and sent out magnetic currents that can be caught from far off, whereas something in the masculine constitution, something dense, thick, opaque, obtuse, stupid, has the power of rejecting such contacts. Or it may be that the erotic emotion, when they brim over from the masculine spirit, extricate themselves, as women feelings never do, from the bittersweet honeycomb of nature and shoot off, up, out, and away into dimensions of non-natural existence where the nerve rays of women cannot follow. Those queer analytic elementals, those inquisitive naturalists that very old places full of contorted human history, attract by a species of spontaneous selection, must have derived a malignant pleasure from the words that they heard spoken by Monsieur Caporelli when both the protagonist of the passion had disappeared with Dr. Fell. In true French style, reducing every mortal human feeling into a rigid pattern of logical amorousness, the famous clown had uttered to Ned Adeling words full of an ironic and blasphemous amusement when the unconscious king of the Jews and his blue-robed mother had vanished together to the hospital. A touch of jealousy may have mingled, too, with his sly tone, for Caporelli had been really and truly caught by Percy's slender hips and her graceless tomboy humor. An engaging situation, the clown had remarked, as he was changing his clothes in the gentleman's portion of the eastward-facing pavilion, and a very piquant one, for those two it's been, we may be sure, ever since they hoisted him up. The Middlezoy poet turned upon the laughing brown eyes of the speaker a pair of blue-gray eyes, more chilly cold than the wettest sea fog that came up out of Bridgewater Bay. "Do you think so?" he remarked. "It was lucky she had her car so near." Caporelli fixed a sentimental and whimsical eye upon the spot where he had been so happy with Percy. "Who knows?" he sighed. "You people are so peculiar and so inhuman that it's difficult to say." The elementals of Glastonbury, those naturalists that had hovered over the vaporous humors of 3,000 years of crisscross human tangles, must have howled with laughter when they heard this clever Frenchman's explain in accents dry and logical the relations between Mr. Owens Evans and Mrs. Persephone Spear. Mr. Evans had, as a matter of fact, been caught up into a region of feeling utterly beyond the comprehension of any Latin or any Teutonic mind. This had gone on since he stood before Pilate until the moment when he shouted, "Eloi, Eloi!" It was not, as St. Paul had put it so well, he the one amongst them who would really have understood Mr. Evans. It was not with flesh and blood that he was contending, but with mysterious powers of evil upon levels revealed to few. No equivocal perversity gratified by divining the feelings of Persephone entered for a second into this terrible visions with which, as he hung between heaven and earth, his mind was bruised and broken. The perverse girl had detected, as Cordelia never could have done, the quality of Mr. Evans's feelings, but what she had no idea of was the tragic lengths to which he had carried them. The physical pain he suffered before he shouted that "Eloi, Eloi!" was more acute than he had ever dreamed of underdoing. Both Adeling and the Dubliners were to blame, and indeed still more so was John, for not insisting on Dr. Fell. They could have had confidence in him, being present at one of their rehearsals. Evans had suffered, but not acutely suffered, at these rehearsals. And what he had endured, he had kept to himself, for it was what he wanted. It was the prolongation of the scene, drawn out so foolishly by that luckless dance of death of the two Marys, that it brought upon his collapse, and it was the strain of his arms, bound too tightly by those ropes, and the tension of the muscles of his shoulders stretched between the crossbars, that had caused him such anguish. But not since the bloody king put the last abbot of Glastonbury to death had such physical pain been experienced by anyone upon the slopes of Gwyn ap Nudd's hill. But it would be a mistake to say that the spirit of Mr. Evans has yielded, or weakened, or regretted his undertaking. Right up to the end, till by straining his torso to the breaking point he lost consciousness, he not only endured this anguish, but he exulted in enduring it. His exultation kept mounting and mounting, extreme pain, ecstatic triumph, embracing each other in dark mystic copulation. Mr. Evans became indeed three persons as he hung on his self-imposed cross. One person was his body, another was his soul. He felt his soul, or rather his soul felt itself, to be entirely outside of his body. This phenomenon was to him, as he hung alone there, looking down on that vast crowd, as much of a definite, concrete experience as the pain itself. The pain became a third person, and the soul of Mr. Evans kept urging on the pain. He felt as if this crowd beneath him was not the whole human race. It was indeed the whole human race, and that by the transaction that was now proceeding between these three persons, thus suspended in the air above them, this crowd, in immense animal passivity, was in some way recreated, purged, cleansed, transformed. His body, as the pain increased, as his soul deliberately caused this pain to increase, began to overbrim the confines of its human shape. His body projected itself under the pain in great waves of filmy chemical substance. It flung forth this filmy substance in streams and torrents in a mighty, rushing rain. And then there arrived a moment when Mr. Evans knew that his body was the whole hill, the whole field, nay, the whole wide stretching landscape. Into this landscape, into this earth bulk that was his body, his soul kept driving the pain, compelling it to bury itself deeper and deeper into this living mass. This continued till his body became more than the mere immediate landscape. It became the whole round earth, swinging on its orbit through space, and above this earth body hung the master spirit of Mr. Evans, still driving the pain on. He was the Zeus and Prometheus and the vulture, all three linked indestructibly together. And all the while a triumphant ecstasy poured down from him like a bloody sweat. Nor must it be supposed that Mr. Evans' rational mind, that poor portion of his conscience that indulged its activity apart from pain or pleasure, was paralyzed all this while. Those two manners, which John Crow had noted as long ago as their encounter at Stonehenge as peculiar to the man, were not superficial. They represented the workings of his deepest nature. His pedantry, as people called it, was as much heightened by his present suffering as was his imagination. As other men visualized their past lives at the moment of drowning, so Mr. Evans, in the midst of his anguish, even while he identified the substance of his flesh with the whole round earth from which it was projected, was intensely aware of the peculiar history of the spot beneath him. The pain he endured turned his pedantic inquisitiveness into a living medium, acutely sensitive, quiveringly receptive, through which the whole history of Glastonbury began to pour. Glastonbury seemed to have waited for this sacrifice of Mr. Evans to exhale upon the air its darkest and most terrible secrets. That no one heard these secrets except the man himself, who was now the medium for them, mattered nothing to these singular revenants. They found Mr. Evans's anguishing entity suspended above the soil of that historic spot, and they seized upon it, just as a horde of wild and gusty winds, blown here, blown there, might seize upon an Aeolian harp hung aloft in the lonely place. Thus it came upon that another pageant, much more grim and much less romantic than the one that had been played that day, passed through Mr. Evans's brain. Kings and prelates, saints and sodomites, madmen and monks, whores and nuns, people executed and people imprisoned, together with a woeful procession of common nameless people, upon whose toil and hunger others lived, streamed in a wild torrent of heads, and faces, and arms, and limbs, through the tormented consciousness of Mr. Evans. And the crowd was not only human, There lay out of that the worst horrors of it. Mingled with the human torrent were other living things, animals, birds, and even fish. All the eyes that in the long history of this place had looked in vain into those of the killer, all those tormented eyes gathered now about Mr. Evans. And it was all connected with his deadly, his immediate, imitable vice, irredeemable vice. The figure that flooded his brain were all torturers or victims, even every one of them. And as the thing grew and grew upon him, as he hung there, all the victims flowed into one and became one, and all the torturers flowed into one and became one. Then it came about that between Mr. Evans, as a torturer, and this one victim, who Yell was all victim, a dialogue arose, so that from their divided localities in space they addressed each other, and from their horrible associations in time they answered each other. "Forgiveness for you!" cried this voice, rising from all the victims of Glastonbury, since the tribes of men had first come there, "can never, never be. For you did this thing, and went on doing it, knowing what it meant. Others tortured me from brutality, from insensitiveness, from stupidity. You and those who were like you did it, knowing what it meant. It was that knowledge, knowing what I felt, and yet not stopping, that has made forgiveness impossible." The terror of the voice made Mr. Evans feel like a thing that twisted on the floor of the pit, and yet out of the smoke of his torment he uttered a reply. "In eternity we are as one," he cried hoarsely. There was a silence for a moment, or so it seemed to him as he hung there for 1,000 years. Then the voice was lifted up again. "Never can we be as one. I have looked into your eyes and you did not stop. Each moment you went on made the difference greater. It can never be crossed now. It is a gulf of eternity now. You could not hear me if I did not. If you could not hear me if I did forgive you." And once more, as he heaved himself to and fro, he replied to this voice. "Christ can forgive me. Christ holds eternity in his hand." And again there was a silence of 1,000 years. "I am Christ," cried the voice, in a tone that made the flesh wrinkle like blown sand upon Mr. Evans's bones. "Every victim, whether you've done it for your science or your ambition or your religion or your lust, whether it be a beaten prisoner, a trapped beast, a dog strapped down for vivisection, a racked heretic, a burnt Negro, a tortured child, is I. Yes, is I myself. And you are right when you say that I hold eternity in my hand. These voices come, those voices that are my voice. Can you gather them up, these victims of yours, these tortured, hunted, trapped victims by their thousands upon thousands? Can you gather them up where you have crucified them? Can you cause the earth to yield again to you their black blood? Can you cause the air to return to you their pitiful cries? I have heard the voices of men, yes, and of wise men too, how they have said, all is equal, all is permitted. It is I and none other, I, the Christ, who speak thus to you from eternity, and I say unto you, all is not equal, all is not permitted. Even yet, even after hearing these things, such power hath the spirit of a mortal creature to fight for its life, Mr. Evans was still able to reply to the voice. I could not answer you, he murmured hoarsely, if I were not answering you from the cross. You forget what you have done, went on the voice, and it was like the voice of the wind over the sea. You forget, you forget. Mr. Evans' tone was a terrible veracity now. It is you who say that to me, he cried out. No, no, Christ or devil, you are wrong there. Never have you let me forget. Never for one moment. And it was then that the voice became a vast anonymous voice, gathered up, it seemed, from so much suffering in the world as to be rendered almost inarticulate. It came to Mr. Evans's ears out of all the gills of fishes, out of the gullets of beasts, out of the shards of insects, out of the throats of birds, out of the wounded coils of slow worms, out of prisons, out of hospitals, out of madhouses and domestic torture rooms. And as it rose and sank, as it sank and rose, it accused man, man the cruel, man the blood fiend, man the voluptuous tormentor, man the rejoicer in pain, man the inventor of pain, man the pain begetter, the pain eater, the pain drinker, the pain devil. And from the abysses of Mr. Evans's consciousness leapt up into the day, like an eel, out of fathomless mud, a question for the crucified man-god. So evil, so cruel, so base, O Lord, of the generations of men, why dost thou seek to redeem them with thy suffering? Why dost thou not cause a flood to arise, as at the beginning, and drown forever their itching, biting, stinging, scorpion lust in smooth, deep fathoms of oblivious water? And the voice replied to him again, and it was now so low and yet so searching that it was like a wind stirring the horns of snails, and touching the hairs of the throats of nightjars, and moving the antennae of butterflies, and lifting the gold dust from the cracks of puffballs, and blowing the gray dust from the droppings of weasels, and rippling the brown rainfall in the cups of fungi, and fretting the light scurf on the brittle skulls of the newborn, and the rheum drops on the eyelids of extreme age, and the sweat drops on the forehead of death. And the voice whispered, For those that are forgiven, there shall be a new heaven and a new earth. And Mr. Evans groaned forth his retort to this. But what of those that cannot be forgiven? Is that new heaven and that new earth built upon the Golgotha of the second death? The voice at this became so low that the ears of the man, clairaudient as he was through his suffering, could not distinguish words. It is God, and he is lying to me, thought Mr. Evans. He is lying to me. People lie to the condemned for whom there is no hope. And Mr. Evans, hanging there in his great anguish, hardened his heart against the voice. We are alone, his soul whispered to his body, and to the pain that he was inflicting on his body. They have left us quite alone. And it was then that he lost consciousness. This was what only one person afterwards would believe when he told them about it, namely, that he had no recollection of shouting with a great shout that Eloi, Eloi, which brought the blood from his mouth. Cordelia would not believe it, nor would Persephone, nor would John, nor would Mr. Barter, nor would Aunt Laura, the matron of the ward, where he came presently, as the ironic human phrase runs, to himself. The only person who believed it was Mr. Girard. And the extraordinary thing was, when, a couple of weeks after, the mayor of Glastonbury was visiting him in the hospital, and he was telling him about this, such must have been the heat of the day, or the distressing sights in their particular ward, that Mr. Girard, after accepting his account without question, fainted dead away. Well, that's the end of Pageant. That chapter, the Pageant. Next will be Volume 2. We're up to Volume 2. I believe there's only 2 volumes. I guess I can check right now. Why not? I think there's a... I don't know. Yeah, maybe this... here we go. That's the characters. Volume 1. Yeah, I thought there was a chapter section in here, isn't there? Oh, here we go. Yeah, there's only 2 volumes, so... We're at the start of the last volume, the second volume. Idolatry is the next chapter. Chapter 20. Oh, it has the chapter numbers on here. So we're up to chapter 20 now. Volume 2. Idolatry, next Glastonbury. I quite like that one today. Very psychedelic and depressing. Anyway. Just Hang in there.